All right, so I'm actually trying to figure out when was the first time that I became aware that the Rogue Magneto relationship was a thing. And I don't mean on X-Men 97, because this wasn't a story they just made up for the cartoon. No, they've been very good at taking all kinds of stories over the last several decades of the X-Men comics and doing their best to kind of blend them and meld them into, what we get in the cartoon series. That's what they did back in the 90s. That's certainly what they are doing currently with 97. In this last past episode alone, you got, Genosha and Krakoa elements all blended into one story. You got Madeline Pryor and Emma Frost all kind of blended into one story. That is to say, the psychic affair that was going on with Scott. And then, of course, there's the Rogue Magneto. So, all right, so I'm pretty sure it was like either an image I saw online back in the day, or maybe I actually saw the comic when I was like flipping through some old comics, like some sort of variant cover of, Savage Land clad Magneto and Rogue embracing in like this intense kiss. And even though I don't quite remember where it was or when it was, I do remember exactly how I felt at the time. No, stop it. No, bad mutants. No. Now, granted, as was recently discussed, I was always a huge fan of Gambit. And the relationship between Gambit and Rogue, I shipped them hard. That was probably one of the first things I ever shipped before I even knew what shipping was called. And the notion of a Rogue Magneto relationship was nowhere in the cartoon, which was my kind of primary source for who these characters were. So reading up on how, there was this time that Rogue lost her powers, she was in the Savage Land with Magneto, there's some flirtation, there's this innuendo of what could be a relationship, and then, Rogue's kind of into it, but then all of a sudden Magneto offs a dude, and she's like, oh yeah, that's right, you're a freaking supervillain, of course I'm not gonna hook up with you. And that was kind of it. And while there's obvious visual nods to that story in kind of this decision they've made to go in X-Men 97 with the Rogue Magneto relationship, you kind of see, kind of nods to the Savage Land motif that we've got going on in some of those flashbacks. But for the most part, they're really leaning more into a legitimate actual relationship, highly problematic, going to talk about that in a second, but more akin to the Age of Apocalypse alternate reality relationship had between Magneto and Rogue. This was a thing. There was an alternate universe where Charles Xavier didn't exist. Has to do with his son. It's a whole thing. Anyway, regardless, in this alternate reality, Gambit is pining for Rogue. Rogue likes him as a friend, but she is super into Magneto. Magneto's into her. And this is kind of weird too. Magneto and Gambit are like besties. Also, Magneto leads the X-Men in this alternate reality. Wolverine's called Weapon X, which is awesome. There's another Wolverine that's nothing like Wolverine. There's Age of Apocalypse is really kind of awesome. But yeah, Magneto and Rogue, they're a couple. I'm pretty sure they get married. They have a kid. They name him Charles. It's weird. I'm sorry. It's weird. Even in the comics, it was weird. And the comics doesn't have the oblivious, problematic age differential that they kind of establish in X-Men 97. It's kind of implied, right? Like you sit here doing the math, even in like something like Age of Apocalypse, okay, Rogue and Quicksilver are like contemporaries. So no matter how you slice it or kind of squash the math, this is still a dude who's getting with like his son's friend. You know what I mean? And in X-Men 97, they take that and they kind of flip it, where it's, she's getting with her mom's friend. Either way, yikes. On top of that, he's a teacher. There's a significant imbalance of powers on like multiple ways, right? Not only is he older, not only is he in this kind of teacher-mentor role, but because he is literally the only one that can touch her, he has control over her body in an extremely intimate way. I'm trying to be mindful so that I don't get demonetized here. You know what I'm saying? I'm just saying this is not a great relationship. But here's the thing. I don't think that we're supposed to like look at this flashback and the origins of their relationship and supposed to be like, yeah, you know what? This is great. We're all okay with this. No. I think this gives us insight into who Magneto is to Rogue. Yes, as a retcon, but let's just embrace it, because you know what? The storytelling was so well done that we're just going to give them that's why we never talked about it. That's why we pretended not to know each other. You know what? This episode right here was so well done. You earned it. Okay. I'm going to give it to you. Normally I wouldn't, but it's good. This episode's good. So keeping that in mind, this gives us an insight into who Rogue was and really what her relationship with Magneto is. He's not just some fling with the professor's enemy who's come to take over the school. that in their current age is, yeah, I mean, like, there's an age difference, but it's still appropriate. They're both consenting adults here. But no, this is actually fueled by somebody that really took advantage of her. She was young, innocent, naive, vulnerable. And because of all of this, even to this day, Rogue clearly hasn't even processed the depths of how inappropriate their relationship is. She clearly has some sense of how inappropriate the relationship is. She's ashamed of it at first. She says she wants to keep that cat locked in the bag or whatever kind of hokey thing she said in episode 2 or 3. But regardless, the feelings that she feels are very real. It's complicated. It's like super complicated. It's wrong. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of people that can relate with this, where because people do get abused, because people do get used, and because emotional manipulation is a very powerful tool. And to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that Magneto was doing all of this with Rogue with specific malicious intent, but I do kind of applaud the writers of this series for telling this complex and problematic of a relationship story in the context of the 90s and letting all of these characters process it the way that they would in the 90s. Here in 2024, we see all of this and we got all kinds of commentary problems, and we can pinpoint a lot of different things that are going on here that are just not okay. But this is decades before Me Too. And who is there that Rogue could go to really talk about this? I mean, arguably Charles, granted, but honestly, even him, we're talking about literally sleeping with the enemy. So she's got all of this up inside that has gone completely unanalyzed. And this is, by the way, stacked on tops of like layers of trauma that Rogue has dealt with. We've already talked about that. Anyway, my point is, Magneto Rogue is a relationship that I have never been a big fan of. It does have origins in the comics, and the problems with that relationship were always kind of implied in the comics, and I'm kind of glad that they decided to make them explicit in bringing them into X-Men 97. Now, of course, there's also a big question of like, is this really kind of it for them? Or like, I mean, we just saw Magneto die, right? Right? I don't know. I've got a theory around that. I've got some thoughts. I've got some theories. We're going to talk about it in the next video. For now, put it in the comments. Magneto and Rogue, were you aware prior to X-Men 97 that they dated? What was your thoughts on their relationship in the comics? What are your thoughts on the way that it was adapted to the cartoon? Put it in the comments. Let's talk about it.